October 23rd, 1944. Saipan. The caves weren't supposed to be occupied. Corporal David Martinez swept his flashlight across limestone walls that had been fighting positions 3 months ago and were supposed to be empty now. The beam caught nothing but shadows and the kind of darkness that feels thicker than it should. Behind him, 3 more soldiers moved with weapons raised, boots crunching on volcanic rock still stained with what battles leave behind. They were looking for weapons caches, ammunition, maybe explosives the Japanese had abandoned when the island fell in July. Standard sweep and secure operation, the kind that gets 2 lines in a patrol report. Then Martinez smelled it. Not cordite or decay. Something worse. Something living. Sickness. Waste. The specific smell of human beings surviving in conditions that shouldn't allow survival. His hand went up. The patrol froze. In the silence, they heard it. Breathing. Shallow. Multiple sources, coming from deeper in the cave system where the darkness turned absolute and flashlights barely made a difference. Martinez keyed his radio. Patrol 3 to command. We've got something. Cave 7. Possible survivors. Survivors? Japanese military? Unknown. Stand by. He moved forward, slowly. The kind of careful that comes from 3 months of cave fighting, where every shadow might hide someone with a grenade and nothing left to lose. The passage opened into a larger chamber, natural cathedral carved by ancient water, now converted into a tomb for the living. Martinez's flashlight swept across the space and stopped. Women, huddled against the far wall like something broken trying to hold itself together. Not soldiers, not the enemy combatants his training had prepared him to find. Just women. Maybe 40 of them. Some young, teenagers, barely older than his sister back in California. Others middle-aged, their faces carved with the kind of exhaustion that ages you decades in months. A few children among them, clinging to adults with the desperate grip of those who've learned that letting go means dying. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the flashlights with eyes that had stopped expecting rescue and started expecting something worse. Martinez's radio crackled. Patrol 3, report. He couldn't find words for a moment. His training had given him language for enemy contact, for casualties, for tactical situations that fit into categories and procedures. This wasn't in any manual he'd read. Command, we've got civilians. Female, approximately 40 plus. They're in bad shape. Even through the static, he heard the confusion in the reply. Female? Japanese? Affirmative. Armed?
Martinez swept his light across them again. They flinched from the beam like it burned. Some covered their faces. Others pulled the sick and the young closer, forming a human shield that would accomplish nothing against rifles, but meant everything about who they'd become in these caves. Negative. No weapons visible. They're dying, sir. Because they were. You didn't need medical training to see it. Emaciation that turned faces into skulls wrapped in parchment. Tropical ulcers visible on bare arms and legs. The shivering that had nothing to do with temperature. The island was furnace hot even in October. And everything to do with bodies shutting down from starvation and dysentery and the simple mathematics of suffering. One woman, older, maybe 50, with gray threading through black hair, met his eyes. Didn't speak, didn't need to, He'd seen that look before, in the faces of men who'd lost too much blood and knew it. She wasn't asking for help. She was asking for it to be quick. The radio again. "Patrol 3, secure the area. Command is sending medical and... hell, I don't know what we're sending. Just sit tight." Martinez lowered his weapon, gestured for his team to do the same. Not because regulations told him to, because pointing rifles at women too weak to stand felt like crossing a line that some part of him, the part that still remembered he'd been a human before he'd been a soldier, refused to cross. Behind him, Private Chen, 19, fresh off the landing ships, whispered what they were all thinking. "Sir, what do we do with them?" Martinez didn't have an answer. The Pacific War had given him experience with banzai charges and artillery barrages and the 1,000 ways men tried to kill each other with maximum efficiency. Nobody had trained him for this, for women in caves, for enemy civilians who'd been left behind like ammunition nobody needed anymore.
For the specific kind of problem where the enemy wasn't armed or dangerous, just terrified and dying. The woman who'd met his eyes made a sound, not quite speech, more like a prayer or a goodbye delivered in Japanese he couldn't understand, but didn't need to. She was telling the others something, preparing them for whatever she thought came next. And Martinez realized with cold certainty that she expected torture, expected execution, expected everything the war had taught both sides to expect from the enemy who wore a different uniform and spoke a different language. She expected monsters, because that's what they'd been told Americans were. Martinez wanted to tell her they weren't, wanted to say something that would bridge the gap between flashlights in the darkness and whatever horrors she'd been taught to expect. But his Japanese consisted of 3 words, and none of them were, "We're not going to hurt you." So he did the only thing he could think of. He set his rifle down, held up empty hands, moved back toward the entrance to wait for command to figure out what doctrine said about finding 43 women in caves 3 months after the war was supposed to be over. 43 women. No weapons. No fight left. Just fear older than any war carved into faces that had forgotten what safety looked like. And somewhere behind him, command was scrambling to find a regulation that explained what to do when the enemy turned out to be something the manual never prepared you for. Something human. Something that should have been protected, not fought. Something that nobody, not the Japanese who'd abandoned them, not the Americans who'd found them, had any idea how to save.
They'd been told Americans were demons who wore human faces. 6 months earlier, Saipan had been different. Before the invasion, before the bombs, before everything that made survival feel like a betrayal of the dead. The island had Japanese schools, medical clinics, administrative offices, 20,000 civilians living alongside 15,000 military personnel in what Tokyo called the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Pacific. Teachers taught children imperial history in classrooms that overlooked volcanic beaches. Nurses tended to garrison soldiers in hospitals that smelled of antiseptic instead of gangrene. Families of settlers planted sugarcane in soil their government promised would be Japanese forever. The women in that cave had been part of that world. Yuki Tanaka had taught elementary school, mathematics and calligraphy to children who would never solve another equation. Reiko Yamada had been a surgical nurse at the civilian hospital, her hands trained to heal, now scarred from weeks of digging roots from cave walls. Michiko Sato, barely 19, had worked in the governor's office, typing reports about crop yields and construction projects for an administration that no longer existed. They'd been ordinary, teachers and nurses and clerks, the infrastructure of civilian life in a war that was supposed to stay somewhere else. Then June arrived, and with it American ships. So many ships, the horizon disappeared behind steel. The propaganda had been preparing them for months. Posters in every public building, radio broadcasts interrupting evening programs, military officers giving lectures to civilian groups about what would happen if the Americans ever breached the outer defenses. The warnings were graphic, specific, designed to ensure that surrender never became an option worth considering. American soldiers, they were told, tortured prisoners, raped women, murdered children for sport. The images shown were carefully curated atrocities. Real or fabricated, it didn't matter. What mattered was the message. Capture meant horror, worse than death. Better to die with honor than live with shame. Better to choose your end than let the enemy choose it for you. The Battle of Saipan lasted 3 weeks. 21 days of artillery that made the earth scream. Of naval bombardments that turned buildings into memory and memory into dust. Of fighting that moved through the island like fire through paper, consuming everything. 30,000 Japanese died, military and civilian. The distinctions stopped mattering somewhere around day 14. When the lines collapsed, when retreat became rout, became annihilation, the civilians faced the choice the propaganda had prepared them for.
At Marpi Point, the northern cliffs overlooking the Philippine Sea, families gathered by the hundreds, mothers, children, elderly, people who'd taught school and tended shops and lived quiet lives that war was never supposed to touch. They jumped. Whole families holding hands, rather than face what they'd been told waited below in American hands. The cliffs are 200 feet high, the ocean doesn't forgive, and for 3 days, the water at the base ran red with people who chose death over demons. Not all of them jumped. Some soldiers, knowing the battle was lost, knowing they'd be ordered to die fighting, hid groups of civilians in caves. Not out of official strategy, out of the desperate human impulse to save someone when everything else is ending. They stashed women and children in the island's limestone networks, gave them what supplies could be spared, and told them to wait. For what? Nobody knew. Rescue that wasn't coming, a counteroffensive that would never arrive, maybe just time, hoping the Americans would declare victory and leave. The soldiers went to die. The women went into darkness. Yuki, Reiko, Michiko, and 40 others, crammed into caves that became prisons without guards, waiting in the dark while the battle sounds faded and the silence that followed was somehow worse. Weeks became months. The supplies ran out. Then the water. Then hope. Dysentery turned the caves into latrines. Starvation made children stop crying, because crying takes energy they didn't have. Tropical ulcers festered in the humidity. Bodies started shutting down with the methodical cruelty of biology that doesn't care about patriotism or propaganda. They prayed. Not for rescue. Rescue would mean capture, and capture meant the horrors they'd been warned about. They prayed for death. Quick. Clean. Before the demons found them. Some of the younger women talked about Marpi Point, wondered if those families had made the right choice, if jumping would have been better than this slow withering in the dark. But by the time that conversation started, most of them were too weak to walk, let alone climb. So they waited, in the darkness, among the sick and the dying, listening to the island above go silent as the Americans declared victory and began the work of occupation. And they knew, with the certainty of people who'd been told the same lie enough times it became truth, that eventually The demons would come into the caves, would find them, would do what demons do. October 23, 1944. Martinez's flashlight cutting through the darkness, American voices echoing off limestone, the specific moment when waiting ended and inevitability arrived. The demons had found them. Only they weren't demons. They were men, 19 and 20 years old, speaking English and carrying rifles and looking just as confused as the women were terrified. But Yuki didn't know that yet. Reiko didn't know that. Michiko, who'd spent 3 months certain she'd die screaming, didn't know that the boy with the flashlight was more scared of hurting them than they needed to be of him. All she knew was what she'd been taught, what the posters said, what the radio promised, what Marpy Point proved, that Americans were monsters. And monsters don't show mercy. They'd survived the battle, survived the caves, survived 3 months of slow dying in the dark. But survival, they'd learned, was just a different way of waiting for the end. And now the end had arrived with flashlights and American voices and the absolute certainty that everything they'd feared was about to come true.
The battalion command tent smelled like coffee and confusion. Captain Robert Hendricks stood over a field table scattered with documents that were supposed to have answers. Geneva Convention protocols, Army regulations on prisoner handling, field manuals that covered everything from interrogation procedures to ration distribution. None of them mentioned what to do when your prisoners were dying from fear. His staff sergeant had pulled every relevant document. They'd radioed division headquarters. They'd even contacted the Navy hospital ship offshore, looking for precedent, procedure, something that fit the situation sitting in Cave 7. The regulations were clear on male combatants, crystal clear. How to search them, secure them, process them through the POW system designed to handle soldiers who'd surrendered with weapons in hand and fight still in their eyes. But 43 women who'd been hiding in caves for 3 months? Women who wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, wouldn't let medics within 10 feet of them. Women who flinched from flashlights like they expected bullets to follow. The manual had nothing. "Sir," Major Williams leaned over the table, finger on a regulation page. "Geneva Convention, Article 3. We're required to provide food, water, medical care. We're doing that." "They won't take it," Hendricks said. "Then we document the refusal and watch them die." The tent went quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone knows the truth, but nobody wants to say it out loud. Outside, the sound of camp activity. Supplies being unloaded, patrols rotating, the ordinary machinery of occupation moving forward while 43 women slowly died because no regulation covered how to convince people you weren't the monster they'd been taught to fear. Lieutenant Morrison, the battalion medical officer, entered with a clipboard and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from treating patients who refuse treatment. "Captain, we need to talk about timeline." "How long?" 48 hours, maybe less. 3 of them are critical. Dehydration, malnutrition, dysentery. We try to get IVs started, they pull them out. We offer water, they won't touch it. It's like... He searched for words that wouldn't sound insane. It's like they think we poisoned it. "They probably do," said a voice from the tent entrance. Sergeant Kenji Nakamura, 3rd-generation Japanese-American from Seattle, the battalion's interpreter. 22 years old with a face that could bridge cultures and a uniform that marked him as American in a war where that distinction sometimes felt paper-thin. He'd spent 2 hours in Cave 7 trying to communicate, trying to explain in Japanese that they were safe,
that nobody would hurt them, that the medical care was real. The women wouldn't look at him. Hendricks had watched it happen, watched Nakamura speak their language, offer reassurance, extend every cultural courtesy his family had taught him, and watched the women turn away like he was contaminated, traitor, collaborator, something worse than the enemy, one of their own who'd chosen the wrong side. "They think I'm proof," Nakamura said quietly, "that Americans are exactly what the propaganda said, that they break people, make them betray everything. Can you get through to them at all?" "Sir, I could recite poetry, and they'd hear torture confessions. The propaganda didn't just tell them what we do to them, it told them what we'd already done to people like me." He set his helmet on the table. "They're not refusing help. They're preparing for what they think comes after help." The implications sat heavy in the tent. These women expected torture, expected rape, expected systematic brutality, and every act of basic human decency, offering water, bringing medicine, speaking their language, just looked like the first act of something worse to come. They were dying because hope was more dangerous than surrender. Hendricks stared at the regulations. His father had been a missionary in Japan before the war, 18 years in Osaka, teaching English and running a clinic. Hendricks had spent his childhood there, learned the language, learned the culture, learned the specific way honor and shame worked in a society that valued collective dignity over individual survival. He understood what these women were doing. They weren't refusing care. They were maintaining dignity in the only way they had left, by not cooperating, by not giving their captors the satisfaction of gratitude, by choosing to die as Japanese, rather than survive as whatever broken thing they believed capture would make them. It was cultural, it was tragic, and it was killing them. "We're missing something," Hendricks said. "The regulations tell us how to guard prisoners, feed prisoners, process prisoners, but these aren't prisoners, they're victims," Morrison finished. "They're victims who think they're prisoners." "Then we need to change what they think." Williams shook his head. "With respect, sir, we can't force them to believe we're—" "Not force, prove." Hendricks looked up from the useless regulations. "They've been told we're monsters. Every interaction with us confirms what they expect, so we need to do something they don't expect. Something that can't be misread." "Like what?" That was the question, wasn't it? How do you prove humanity to people who've been taught you don't have any? How do you offer care to people who see care as threat? How do you bridge a gap built from propaganda and war and fear so old it's become truth? The tent flap opened. Private Chen, Martinez's patrol, stuck his head in. "Sir, the women in Cave 7, they're asking for something. Or, not asking. One of them keeps repeating a word. Nakamura." The sergeant straightened. "What word?" "Sounded like Samui. She keeps saying it, pointing at the others. Samui." Nakamura's expression shifted. "Samui. It means cold." Morrison frowned. "Cold? Sir, it's 85 degrees out there." "It's not temperature," Nakamura said quietly. "When someone's dying in Japanese culture, they say they're cold. It's how you tell others you're not going to make it." The tent went silent again. "She's telling the others they're going to die," Hendricks said. "Or asking for something to make dying more comfortable." Nakamura looked at the captain. "In Japanese culture, when someone's dying, you cover them, keep them warm. It's respect, dignity, the last kindness." Hendricks stared at him, then at the regulations that had nothing useful to say, then at the problem that had just inverted itself from question to answer. They weren't cold, but they were dying. And in their culture, that meant the same thing. They were asking, without asking, for the dignity their culture said dying people deserved. "They need blankets," Hendricks said. Williams blinked. "Sir?" "Not regulations, not protocol, not procedures." Hendricks stood. "They need blankets. Warm. Clean. The kind of thing you give someone when you're trying to comfort them, not control them. With respect, sir, blankets aren't going to fix malnutrition and... No. But they might fix fear." Hendricks looked at Nakamura. "If we give them warmth, comfort, the specific cultural gesture that says we see you as human, they might believe it," Nakamura finished. "They might accept help. Or they might die wrapped in American blankets thinking we poisoned them," Williams said. "Maybe." Hendricks gathered up the useless regulations. "But right now, they're dying thinking we're monsters. I'd rather they die knowing we tried to be human." The manual told him how to guard prisoners, how to feed them, how to document their refusal of care, how to do everything right according to regulations while watching 43 women die because fear was stronger than survival. What it didn't tell him, what no regulation could ever tell him, was how to prove to people who'd been taught to fear you that fear was the only thing they had left to lose. Hendricks returned to Cave 7 after dark. Not as captain, not with staff or medics, or the apparatus of military authority. Just him and a flashlight, standing at the cave entrance watching shadows huddled together in the deeper darkness beyond. The women were shivering, all of them, despite the fact that October in Saipan felt like breathing through wet wool, despite tropical heat that made soldiers sleep in their skivvies and pray for breeze. They shivered like it was winter. Lieutenant Morrison stood beside him, voice quiet. "It's not cold, it's shock. Their bodies are shutting down. When you're dying from starvation, from dehydration, temperature regulation goes first. They think they're already dead," Hendricks said. "Medically, 3 of them are close." Hendricks watched the eldest woman, the one who'd met Martinez's eyes that first day, wrap her arms around a younger girl, trying to share warmth that neither of them had, trying to comfort in a situation where comfort was a language nobody spoke anymore. And he remembered something, a memory from childhood. Osaka, 1925, his father's mission clinic, a winter storm that had knocked out power, Japanese families arriving with blankets, not for themselves, for others. The specific cultural ritual of care, bringing warmth to those who needed it, offering it with both hands, the gesture saying what words sometimes couldn't. Hendricks had watched it happen, watched Nakamura speak their language, offer reassurance, extend every cultural courtesy his family had taught him, and watched the women turn away like he was contaminated, traitor, collaborator, something worse than the enemy, one of their own who'd chosen the wrong side. "They think I'm proof," Nakamura said quietly, "that Americans are exactly what the propaganda said, that they break people, make them betray everything. Can you get through to them at all?" "Sir, I could recite poetry, and they'd hear torture confessions. The propaganda didn't just tell them what we do to them, it told them what we'd already done to people like me." He set his helmet on the table. "They're not refusing help. They're preparing for what they think comes after help." The implications sat heavy in the tent. These women expected torture, expected rape, expected systematic brutality, and every act of basic human decency, offering water, bringing medicine, speaking their language, just looked like the first act of something worse to come. They were dying because hope was more dangerous than surrender. Hendricks stared at the regulations. His father had been a missionary in Japan before the war, 18 years in Osaka, teaching English and running a clinic. Hendricks had spent his childhood there, learned the language, learned the culture, learned the specific way honor and shame worked in a society that valued collective dignity over individual survival. He understood what these women were doing. They weren't refusing care. They were maintaining dignity in the only way they had left, by not cooperating, by not giving their captors the satisfaction of gratitude, by choosing to die as Japanese, rather than survive as whatever broken thing they believed capture would make them.
Omotenashi. His father had taught him the word, hospitality, but deeper than that. The act of anticipating need before it's spoken, of providing care that preserves dignity. These women needed warmth, not temperature, but the kind that said, you are seen as human, not threat. The kind regulations couldn't provide. He turned to Morrison. How long do we have? To save them? We're out of time. To convince them to let us try? However long it takes for them to die believing we're monsters. Hendricks walked back to his tent, called his supply officer at 0200 hours. Sir? Staff Sergeant Porter answered, voice thick with sleep. I need 50 wool blankets, standard issue, by dawn. Silence. Then, blankets, sir? For what purpose? It doesn't matter? Well, yes, sir. I mean, for requisition, I need to document. They're for the women in Cave 7. Another pause. Sir, with respect, that's not in the manual. POW provisions cover rations, medical supplies, shelter facilities. Blankets aren't. I don't care what's in the manual. Captain, if I submit a requisition for enemy prisoner comfort items, Division's going to ask questions I don't have answers for. Then don't tell them they're comfort items. Tell them they're medical supplies. Tell them it's shock treatment. Tell them whatever you need to tell them. Hendricks' voice didn't rise, didn't need to. But I need 50 blankets by 0600 hours. Yes, sir. He called a staff meeting at 0300. Williams, Morrison, Nakamura, and 3 other officers who looked like they'd been pulled from sleep and weren't happy about it. Hendricks laid it out. Simple. Direct. They were going to distribute blankets to the women. Not as regulation, as gesture. Williams spoke first. Sir, this is a waste of resources. We've got soldiers who could use those blankets come winter. We're in the tropics. Sir, you know what I mean. These are enemy prisoners. We provide food and medical care because Geneva Convention requires it. Blankets aren't required. Neither is letting them die when we could prevent it. Captain! Williams leaned forward. This sets a precedent. Word gets out we're coddling enemy prisoners. It affects how other units handle. These aren't soldiers, Hendricks cut in. They're teachers, nurses, clerks. Civilian women who've been in caves for 3 months thinking every day they're going to be tortured to death. And we can follow every regulation perfectly and watch them die. Or we can prove we're different than what they've been told. The tent went quiet.
Morrison cleared his throat. The blankets alone won't save them. We still need them to accept water, food, medical care. I know, but maybe if we show them something they don't expect, something that can't be misread as threat, maybe they'll believe the rest isn't either. Nakamura spoke. In Japanese culture, offering a blanket to someone who's suffering isn't just practical, it's symbolic. It says, I see your pain. I want to ease it. It's how you show respect to someone dying. They're not dying.
William said. They think they are. And in their culture, that means we should treat them accordingly. Nakamura looked at Hendricks. If we do this right, approach slowly, bow first, offer with both hands, it speaks a cultural language they understand, one that propaganda can't distort. Williams shook his head. And if they refuse, if they see this as manipulation, then we've lost nothing except 50 blankets, Hendricks said. But if they accept, if one woman takes one blanket and doesn't die from it, that's propaganda proven wrong. That's fear cracking. He turned to Morrison. I need nurses, female, to make the approach. The women won't trust us, men, soldiers, but women in uniform, medical personnel, that might read different. The Navy hospital ship has nurses. I can ask. Do it. By 0500, Porter had delivered 43 blankets, wool, standard issue. He'd pulled them from stores, had them cleaned, folded them with the care usually reserved for inspection day. Hendricks had them laid out in the morning sun. Not regulations, just intuition. Let them warm. Let the gesture carry not just fabric, but heat, the physical sensation of warmth before the emotional meaning behind it. At 0530, 3 nurses arrived from the hospital ship. Lieutenant Sarah Chen led them, Navy, Medical Corps. She listened to Hendricks explain the situation without interrupting, her expression moving from confusion to understanding, to something like determined compassion. What do you need us to do? She asked. Approach them, slowly. Sergeant Nakamura will instruct you on the cultural protocols. Bow, offer with both hands. Let them choose to accept or refuse. And if they refuse, then we've tried, and they know we tried. Nakamura spent 20 minutes coaching. How to bow, how to hold the blanket, how to make eye contact without staring, how to wait for acceptance without forcing it. The specific choreography of offering comfort to people who expected cruelty.
Chen and her nurses practiced. Awkward at first, then smoother, the ritual becoming muscle memory. At 0600, they gathered at Cave 7's entrance. 3 nurses in Navy whites, Nakamura in Army uniform. Hendricks and Morrison standing back, present but not leading. And 43 blankets, folded, warm from sun, waiting to become either proof or one more broken promise. Hendricks felt the doubt then, the question that had been sitting in his chest since he'd made the call. What if this made it worse? What if the women saw this as manipulation, as the first move in whatever horror they'd been promised was coming? What if kindness looked like cruelty through the lens of 3 months' terror? Chen looked back at him, waiting for the order. Hendricks nodded. The nurses moved forward, slow, each carrying blankets like offerings, like the most important thing they'd ever carried wasn't medicine or instruments, but wool. Behind them, soldiers watched, some confused, some skeptical, some understanding that whatever happened in the next few minutes mattered more than any regulation they'd been taught. 43 blankets, 43 chances to prove propaganda wrong. 43 moments where the difference between monster and human came down to something as simple as warmth offered freely to people who'd forgotten what free warmth felt like. The sun climbed higher. The nurses disappeared into the cave's entrance. And Hendricks stood in the light, waiting to learn if compassion could speak louder than fear.
The morning light barely reached the cave's interior. Lieutenant Chen led the approach, 3 nurses behind her,
Nakamura beside them, each carrying blankets folded with a precision that had nothing to do with military regulation and everything to do with the weight of what they were attempting. Behind them, at the cave entrance, Hendricks and Morrison waited, close enough to see, far enough to not threaten. Soldiers watching something they'd never been trained for, the specific choreography of proving humanity to people who'd forgotten what it looked like. The women saw them coming. 43 pairs of eyes tracking movement in the half-light, bodies pressing harder against the limestone wall like they could merge with stone and disappear. The eldest woman, Yuki, though nobody knew her name yet, pulled the youngest closer, protective, preparing them for what came next. Nakamura spoke first, soft, in Japanese, the language of their childhood and their nightmares. "We brought these for you. You must be cold." The words hung in the cave's stillness, not quite echo, not quite silence, something suspended between offer and threat that 3 months of terror made impossible to distinguish. The women didn't respond, couldn't. Their mouths were pressed into thin lines, their hands clutched at each other with the grip of people drowning. Chen took one step forward. The women flinched. She stopped, held the blanket with both hands, the way Nakamura had taught her, the way Japanese culture said respect was carried, and she bowed deep. The kind of bow that said, "I acknowledge you, I honor you, I am not here to harm you." Then she straightened, extended the blanket toward Yuki, the woman who'd spent 3 months keeping these others alive through sheer force of will that had nothing left to give. Chen's Japanese was halting, practiced that morning until the pronunciation was right. "Please, you are safe." Yuki stared at the blanket, at Chen's face, at the soldiers visible beyond the cave entrance, rifles lowered but present, a reminder that safety was a word and they were still prisoners, and this could still be the first act of something worse.
Her hands trembled. Her eyes darted between the blanket and the men outside, between the fabric and the fear, between what she'd been taught to expect and what she was being offered. 30 seconds passed, maybe more. Time measured not in numbers, but in held breath and heartbeats too loud. Then, Yuki's hand moved. Slow, reaching, like touching something that might burn or break or prove to be illusion the moment contact was made. Her fingers brushed the wool, and she gasped. Sharp, surprised, the sound of someone encountering something impossible. Because the blanket wasn't just fabric. It was warm, sun-heated, intentionally warmed, the kind of small detail that separated procedure from care, regulation from recognition. They'd thought of her comfort, of her need for warmth that wasn't temperature, of the cultural gesture that said, "We see you dying, and we want you to live." Yuki took the blanket, pulled it to her chest with both hands, pressed it against her face, felt warmth she hadn't felt in 3 months of cave darkness and starvation and waiting for death that wouldn't come and rescue that couldn't. And she broke. Not quiet tears, not dignified grief, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere deeper than lungs, the kind of crying that happens when the dam finally breaks and everything you've been holding inside, fear and exhaustion and the weight of keeping others alive when you were dying yourself, floods out all at once. She collapsed to her knees, the blanket still clutched, her crying echoing off limestone walls that had heard nothing but whispered prayers and dying breaths for months. The second nurse moved forward, offered another blanket to the woman beside Yuki. She took it, immediately, no hesitation, wrapped it around her shoulders and started crying too. The third woman, fourth, fifth, within minutes,
Within heartbeats that felt suspended in amber, all 43 women were wrapped in American wool, and all 43 were weeping. Some pulled the blankets over their heads and rocked. Others clutched them while staring at the soldiers outside with expressions that cycled through disbelief and confusion and the first fragile shoots of something that might become trust if it wasn't crushed. One of the youngest, maybe 19, a nurse trainee before the war made nursing something else, approached Chen directly. Her steps were unsteady. Malnutrition made walking hard, but she came anyway. And she bowed. Deep, formal, the kind of bow that carried weight. When she straightened, tears running down a face that was all angles and shadows, she whispered in broken English, "Thank you, thank you." Chen's professional composure cracked. She was crying too now, trying not to, failing. Because there's no training for this, no regulation for watching people realize they might not die, that mercy might be real, that the monsters they'd been taught to fear were offering them softness when they'd expected cruelty. At the cave entrance, soldiers watched. Some stood rigid. Some wiped their eyes with the backs of their hands. All of them were witnessing something that would sit in their memories differently than the battles and the casualties and the 1,000 other moments war had given them. They were watching hate dissolve, not through force, through blankets. Hendrik stood apart from his men, face neutral, but his hands were shaking. The gamble had paid off. The cultural gesture had spoken louder than words or weapons or regulations. 43 women who'd been dying from fear were accepting comfort for the first time in months. Nakamura moved among them now, translating fragments, soft Japanese mixed with tears and relief and questions that had no easy answers. "I thought we would die today. They gave us softness. Are we truly safe?" Morrison's medical team came forward, slowly, no sudden movements, carrying water, rations, medical supplies, the same items these women had refused for days. They offered water to Yuki. She looked at it, at the medic, at the blanket in her hands that proved maybe, possibly, this wasn't the trap she'd been taught it would be. She drank. Others followed. Water, food, medicine. Everything they'd refused because acceptance felt like collaboration with their own torture. Everything that now, wrapped in wool warmth, felt like it might be what it appeared to be. Help. The barrier hadn't been broken by force, not by regulations or procedures or the proper protocol for handling enemy prisoners. It had been broken by 43 blankets, by nurses who'd learned to bow, by Sergeant Nakamura speaking his grandmother's language with a gentleness that war usually didn't allow, by Captain Hendricks, who'd looked at regulations and decided humanity mattered more. Outside, the tropical morning brightened. The camp continued its routines, supplies moved, patrols rotated. The war went on, because wars don't stop for moments of grace. But inside Cave 7, something had shifted. 43 women who'd spent 3 months waiting to die were crying because they'd been given warmth. And in those tears, in the way they clutched wool like it was more precious than water, was proof that even in war, even across languages and uniforms and propaganda that painted enemies as demons, Humanity could be a weapon against hate.
Not the kind of weapon that destroyed, the kind that built. One blanket, one gesture, one moment of warmth offered freely to people who'd forgotten what warmth felt like. And 43 women learning that sometimes the monsters were just frightened people on the other side of the darkness. Same as them.
3 weeks after the blankets, the women left Cave 7 for the last time, not as prisoners being transported, as patients being transferred to a proper medical facility with beds and running water and doctors who didn't have to fight regulations to provide care. They walked slowly. Malnutrition takes longer to heal than fear, but they walked, and some of them carried their blankets folded over their arms like something precious that couldn't be left behind. All 43 survived, every single one, in a war where survival rates for isolated civilians averaged maybe 60%, where disease and starvation killed more than bullets. 43 women who'd been days from death all lived to see Transfer Day. The medical corps called it unprecedented. Hendricks called it proof that sometimes the right thing works even when regulations say it shouldn't. Command called him in 2 days later. The office was small, functional. His battalion commander sat behind a desk covered with paperwork that included Hendricks's unauthorized requisition for 50 wool blankets classified as medical supplies in documentation that nobody quite believed. "Captain," the commander didn't look up from the forms. "50 blankets for enemy prisoners. Care to explain?" "They were dying, sir. The blankets helped." "That's not what I asked." Hendricks stood at attention. "No excuse, sir. I requisition supplies outside of standard protocol. If there are consequences, I accept them." The commander finally looked up, studied him for a long moment. The kind of look that weighs decisions against outcomes and tries to find the line between good results and bad precedent. "Those women are being repatriated once they're stable enough. All 43. The Navy hospital is calling their recovery remarkable." He tapped the requisition form. "So I've got a problem, Captain. I've got an officer who violated procurement regulations, and I've got 43 civilians who'd be dead if he hadn't."
Yes, sir. Would you do it again? Hendricks didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. The commander nodded slowly, set the forms aside. So would I. But don't put it in your report. Officially, those blankets were medical supplies properly requisitioned under my authorization. Unofficially, he almost smiled. We never had this conversation. Hendricks left with no reprimand on his record, and the quiet understanding that sometimes orders work best when they're given retroactively. But the story didn't stay quiet. It spread the way stories do in the military. Through letters home, through transfers to other units, through the informal network of soldiers who'd been watching when nurses walked into darkness with wool and came out with proof that compassion could break propaganda. Other units dealing with civilian prisoners started asking different questions, not just how to guard them, but how to help them. Not just how to follow regulations, but how to recognize when regulations failed humanity. The blanket distribution didn't become policy. Command couldn't codify compassion, but it became precedent. The kind that changed conversations about enemy civilians from threats to be managed to people to be protected. The war ended. The women went home to Japan, to a country that had lost and was learning what defeat meant, to families that had survived or hadn't, to lives that had to be rebuilt from ruins, literal and figurative. Hendricks received a letter in 1952, 7 years after Saipan.
forwarded through military channels with Nakamura's name in the return address and a note. "Thought you should see this," she asked me to translate. The letter was from Yuki, the eldest woman, the one who'd taken the first blanket and taught the others that accepting help wasn't betrayal. She was teaching again, elementary school in Osaka, mathematics and calligraphy, to children who'd been born into peace and didn't remember the war their parents couldn't forget. The letter was simple, factual, the way people write when emotions are too large for flowery language.
The blanket was the first time I believed I might live, the first time I thought perhaps the world was not only cruelty. I kept it. I show it to my students when I teach them about kindness. Some of them ask why I would keep something from the enemy. I tell them it was never from the enemy. It was from human beings who remembered they were human beings first. She still had it, that blanket, worn now, thin, but folded carefully in her home like a relic from a war where the most powerful weapon turned out to be warmth freely given. Other women wrote too, over the years, through Nakamura, who'd become a translator in civilian life and maintained connections to the people whose language he'd spoken on a cave floor in October 1944. Their testimonies varied, but the core was the same. The blankets had been proof that mercy existed, even in merciless times, that propaganda could be wrong, that the enemy could be human. Hendricks never sought recognition, never spoke publicly about Cave 7 or the decision that had saved 43 lives. He returned to civilian life, became a teacher himself, history, ironically, and died in 1987 with an obituary that mentioned his service but not his defiance. But Nakamura remembered, and in 1995 he published a memoir about his years as a military interpreter, about being the bridge between cultures that were trying to kill each other, about the impossible position of speaking your enemy's language for your own side and never being fully trusted by either. He dedicated an entire chapter to the blanket captain, to Hendricks, who'd remembered that regulations serve humanity, not the other way around, to the nurses who'd learned to bow, to the 43 women who taught everyone watching that survival sometimes requires accepting help from people you were taught to fear. The story gets taught now, sometimes, in military cultural training courses about working with civilian populations, in ethics seminars about balancing protocol with humanity, not as doctrine, but as reminder that wars are fought between governments and armies and ideologies, but compassion happens between people, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the smallest acts of dignity can break the largest cycles of hate. 43 women went home because one captain looked at regulations and asked a different question. Not, what am I allowed to do, but what am I able to do? Not, how do I guard prisoners, but how do I help human beings? The blankets got old, worn. Some were lost to time and moving and the ordinary entropy of objects that aren't weapons or metals. But a few survived, passed down, kept in closets in attics like family heirlooms, because they were proof that someone's grandmother had survived not just war, but the belief that war made everyone monsters. And on quiet days, in a school in Osaka, a teacher named Yukiora showed her students a faded American wool blanket and told them what warmth meant when you'd forgotten what warmth felt like. Sometimes, the most powerful weapons aren't the ones designed to destroy. They're the ones that prove we can still build, even in the midst of tearing apart. Even when regulations say no. Even when fear says it's impossible. Sometimes, humanity
is the only weapon worth carrying.